Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to It Says What, where JW3 and Limmud bring you unexpected Jewish texts every week. I am Joe Hyman, JW3's young adult programmer, and JW3 is the UK's Jewish Community and Art Centre. We are partnering to bring you this program with Limmud, a diverse and inclusive worldwide community of Jewish learning. We have been putting on lots of online programming throughout this period. This is actually our 15th program of It Says What. It's really exciting to be having this program throughout the period. This series asks educators, artists, and leaders from across the Jewish community in the UK and abroad today to share a surprising piece of Jewish wisdom for our time. You're able to ask your own questions towards the end. Please comment on the live feed or in the webinar in the Q&A function, and we will take some in the conversation that I have with our speaker towards the end. I am delighted to welcome Rabbi Dina Brawer, born and raised in Milan, Italy, studied in Jerusalem, New York, and London. She holds a BA in Hebrew and Jewish Studies from the University of London and an MA in Education and Psychology from the Institute of Education. She also holds Smicha from Yeshivat Maharat. She is the founder of JW3 UK and the producer of Your Torah podcast, a journey to discovering Mishnah. She has recently relocated to Boston in Massachusetts and is the director of recruitment and admissions for Yeshivat Maharat in New York. And the bio doesn't reflect the actual impact that Dina had made on the UK community before she relocated, creating JW3 UK and being a role model to many people in our community. Welcome, Dina. How are you? Good to have you.
Welcome. Good afternoon. It's morning here, but it's wonderful to start my day with a virtual visit to London and JW3. So thank you.
Well, we're really glad to have you. So Dina, tell us, what's the text that you've decided to bring today that makes you say, it says what?
Well, it's a surprising text. It shows up in the Talmud in Tractate Brachot, which is all about blessings. And it's in the context of a discussion about whether God prays. And this particular section is brought as proof that God does pray. But I selected it also, it is surprising, there are many surprising texts, but because of the context of where we find ourselves. We are currently in what is known as the 3 weeks, and in particular the 9 days part of the 3 weeks, a time of mourning for the loss of the temples in the Jewish state, in the Jewish, the temples. And so this is a time we always reflect on what has been lost and what could have been. And for me in particular, it's always a time in which I have to stretch my moral imagination to think about what it really means, this loss of, a temple and sovereignty and, Jewish people living, independently in a certain way. And it always felt a little difficult, but I think in this particular, this year, with the pandemic, with everything that we have lost, with so much ambiguous loss, with so much disenfranchised grief, so many things that, are not what we know, all of a sudden, this kind of very keen sense of nostalgia, of lingering loss that, seems to catch up with us almost every day, as much as we try to kind of really embrace our life, virtually, seems to, make this all much more poignant. So what does the text tell us? Hopefully you can all follow along with me, but perhaps make it a little bit bigger for those who want to really focus. The section here starts with Tanya. It was taught in a Braita. Amar Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha said, Pam achat nichnasti lehaktir ketoret lifnai ulifnim. Once I entered the innermost sanctum to offer incense. This would have been for the Yom Kippur service. And I saw, Vera'iti akatriel ka Hashem tzvaot. And I saw akatriel Yah, the Lord of hosts, seated upon a high and exalted throne. And he said to me, Yishmael beni barcheni, Yishmael, my son, bless me. So this is surprising already for many reasons. this rabbi says he walks into the innermost sanctum room of the temple to offer incense, and he finds a figure seated on a throne, which seems to be God in some form. But of course, giving shape to God is, not something that we do in our religion. And not only that, he goes on to have a conversation, and God invites Yishmael, this rabbi, to bless him. And this continues, and without, I guess, missing a beat, Yishmael has the answer ready, and he says to God, Yehi ratzon mifanecha, shichbeshu rachamecha et kasecha. May be your will that your mercy overcome your anger. V'yagolu rachamecha al midotecha. And may your mercy prevail over your other attributes. V'titnaheg im banecha b'midat harachamim. And may you act towards your children with the attribute of mercy. V'tikanes lahem lifnim mishurat adin. And may you enter before them beyond the letter of the law. So what does the blessing say? Yishmael is telling God, well, I hope you find within you the right way, a more calm, generous, merciful way to behave towards your children. He's almost, scolding God and telling God, well, you haven't been behaving in the best way. And I hope that you kind of find within you the way to behave. And God, the section closes with God kind of agreeing. V'na'anali b'rosho. God kind of nods, yes. And the Talmud then finishes off by the section by saying, oh, well, and this is to teach us that you shouldn't take anybody's blessing too lightly. This is kind of telling us that even a simple person can give an important blessing. And in this case, Rabbi Yishmael can bless God. So, right, it says what? It tells us that a rabbi walks in to offer incense and sees God and has a conversation with God. And not only that, God's asking for something. God's asking for a blessing from a human being. And the human being gives God a blessing. And the blessing he gives is almost, like the subtext is, well, you haven't been on your best behavior. And I think you can do better than this. And God agrees. So what do we do with this text? It is shocking, it is surprising, and it raises a lot of questions. It raises the, question, did this really happen? And of course, this is a story that happens in the rabbinic imagination because Rabbi Yishmael himself, who was a Kohen Gadol, so in theory would have been able to offer incense on Yom Kippur, actually lived after the destruction of the Second Temple. And therefore, there was no temple and no opportunity for him to actually offer incense. So this is something that happens in the rabbinic imagination. And Rabbi Yishmael is living at a time in which the temple has been destroyed and there's this loss. And he lives sometime between the 2nd and 3rd century. So a couple hundred years after the loss of the temple. But it seems like the wound is still very open and very raw. And they're still looking for ways to heal and to move beyond this acute sense of loss, or to find some language for healing it. And so, for me, this text is telling us that the rabbis didn't envisage the destruction at this point as punishment for terrible behavior on part of the Jewish people, but it almost kind of wanted to kind of find a way to move towards healing and, elicit from God, like we can give God a blessing and anybody can give a blessing. And so that's really, I think, audacious way to deal with loss and grief and the sense of, why did God do this to us? And it's almost like playful in some ways in the imagination. So I think what Rabbi Yishmael is doing is creating a very powerful theology for people who are really powerless. At this point, they no longer, have self-determination. They're not independent. They don't have that kind of focus of the temple service. Now, while I think that even while the temple was around and the Jewish people were able to serve in a temple, their life was probably not completely perfect. But with a distance, when you look back, they can cast a rosy glow on that past, perhaps, and the current time doesn't feel as perfect or as good. And perhaps this idea of having this language of blessing and empowering the Jewish people back to heal themselves and heal their being is really important. There is a sort of more recent commentary, the Ben Ish Chai, who lived in Baghdad at the turn of the 20th, or died at the turn of the 20th century. In his commentary on the Talmud, known as Ben Yehoyada, he actually takes this a step further and sees this whole passage with a mystical lens. And what he says is that really, when one goes to ask for a blessing on behalf of the people, then really they're ultimately blessing God, because God and the people are really, in the end, one entity. They cannot be separated. And so asking on the, or advocating on behalf of the people means that we create blessing for God. And so what he's suggesting is that we view this passage as a message to us that after destruction, and when we're in pain and we have grief and loss, what we're tasked with doing is going ahead and really creating blessing. And anybody has that power. And so that sort of takes us back to the very last line of this passage, where it tells us, well, the bottom line is, what it's coming to teach us is that you should not dismiss anybody's blessing. And what I think it says for us in this particular situation, in this period of mourning that is compounded by all the mourning we've had for loss of life, that we haven't been able to grieve entirely properly, for all the little things that we haven't had permission to mourn because there were privileges and there were much more extreme losses and pain. And also for the pandemic has really put a spotlight on the inequities within our society. You know, the access to medical care that is so unequal around the world. The financial and inequities. There's just so much that we are now tasked with rebuilding and healing. And I feel that this text really gives us permission to say, God, we want a more merciful approach, and we have the power to bless, and we need to go back and build. And we have this kind of responsibility now that we've noticed, or we've been forced to face how interconnected we are to each other, that we can rebuild and heal by blessing each other and creating blessing with our actions.
Thank you so much, Dina, for sharing that really resonant and important text at this time to touch on the feeling of the world, essentially, of that kind of that need to mourn and also bless. And also there's a sense of anger in that text as well, that's kind of, at least from my perspective, of kind of shouting out to the Akatri Aliyah, or God in some way, and saying, you know, no, you should be more merciful. I'd love to touch on the kind of the way this process is an emotional process for the person who's actually going about it. But I want to touch on the God element first. I think for a lot of people, this is a surprising text because of this relationship with Yishmael, who isn't in the temple, he isn't in the Kodesh Kodashim. This is an imaginary, maybe kind of it feels dramatic. It feels like a kind of theatrical piece of something to embody a feeling. But he's shouting at God and saying, "Be more merciful." But it seems from what you're saying, and the Ben Ish Chai's perspective, this is about him. This is about the people who are mourning and working out kind of, it's quite humanist, it's quite human focused. So where does God fit in Rabbi Ishmael's story here, or does he not? Or is it just kind of a character in the story?
It's a great question, Joe. It's kind of hard to really, put myself in Rabbi Ishmael's shoe and imagine how he understood God. I can only put myself in my shoes and kind of think about, if I was in that situation. I guess I personally, live life, through a, Hasidic, mystical sort of understanding of the world and God and Judaism. And through that filter, really, when we say, that God is one, and we say, Ein od milvado, there is, no other. According to the mystics, that's like non-dualist, meaning it's not that there isn't another God, but really there's nothing else but God. And so that the entire world, really that is God. And so us as people, making a difference and really ameliorating life for each other, blessing each other, working hard to make a difference for fellow human beings, for other people, that is all bringing blessing to God in some ways. An incredibly powerful way to see God, rather than the angry man in the inner sanctum who had a tantrum, which is almost like what, the words of Rabbi Ishmael imply, right? Oh, you were at a distance and sort of somehow seated on the throne, not quite at level with everybody, and kind of you lost it, and really you need to behave differently. So I think that's an allegory. That's kind of some. It's an idea, it's a concept, but it's not, how we really want to view God. And I'm not sure that that's how Rabbi Ishmael viewed God, but perhaps this is language that is borrowed to sort of, imagine, how our relationship could be, or how it should be, to have that kind of fictional conversation, to let go perhaps of the emotion, and to kind of refocus on the task to be done. Because there is, anger that we cannot, really let, air out almost, for all the things that we've missed, for our lack of control. When we cannot, as people, we want to be able to decide what we're going to do, plan our lives, plan our day-to-day being. And I think personally, it's been the hardest part of this pandemic, not being able to plan for tomorrow, not being able to know. And even now that things are we're hoping are going to move back to normal or a new normal, we still don't know. And the not knowing and the having to go day to day is really hard. And it needs a lot of blessing. It needs a lot of mercy, patience, calm, which is hard to conjure.
100%. I mean, this image of overly abundant mercy in every line that Rabbi Ishmael mentions is something that feels comforting. Just saying it, just seeing the mercy, 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 kind of like you just a continuous supply of mercy, please. And I think that's what the world definitely needs. I'm interested to hear a bit from you about the way in which this feels very different to the world of the kind of Bible, which talks about kind of reward and punishment. And you mentioned that this isn't saying that the people of Israel were responsible for the destruction of the temple. This puts all the blame onto God's inability to control himself, to bring mercy to the forefront of his attributes. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about that. What does that mean in terms of how we normally see responsibility for our actions?
That's a really good question. Because what it also asks of God, what Rabbi Ishmael asks of God, is to go lifnim mishrat adin, meaning don't judge, or don't. Din is judgment. And so again, according to the mystics, there are sort of different sort of aspects and attributes that God expresses says, to the world. And Dina is one of sort of like severity or judgment, where like, if you do wrong, bad things happen type of thing, which is something that we want to avoid. So I can't, I think he does use this expression to say, yes, God can do more, but I think he is also taking responsibility by himself blessing God. I'm going to model how to behave. I'm not going to take this approach of, punishment and sort of destruction. I'm going to model calm and blessing, somebody who I'm really angry with. So it's almost like the human is role modeling for God what it wants to envisage God as saying and doing, right? I'm going to go about doing good and changing the world and blessing people.
It feels euphemistic to say blessing. He's saying blessing because he's getting into that mindset of like, this is really a curse. This is really like an angry outcry, but I'm going to call it a blessing because this is how one behaves in this scenario. And it's really lovely that it ends with the ordinary person, because it seems to be modeling to that ordinary person that they have a voice in this pain. I'm interested in, we've got a comment from one of our audience. Actually, I'll share that. It's from Ruth Finkel, one of our regulars, that perhaps this is Rabbi Yishmael talking to himself and encouraging himself to be better. I think this is clear with what you're saying about the rabbinic imagination. I'm interested to hear about the letter of the law line and how that plays into this. We've heard this in different contexts, go beyond the letter of the law and not just be about strictness. Is that about this attribute of din? Or is there something else going on here that we should be aware of?
Well, Midat HaChassidut, Chesed, is about going beyond the letter of the law. And in fact, the entire Mishnah Avot, ethics, known as Ethics of the Fathers, is all about, how one should sort of stretch themselves to go beyond the letter of the law and kind of, even though you're not obligated necessarily to kind of behave in this way, do more, go beyond. And I think it really captures how the world can really be a better place, because strictly speaking, we can sort of do the minimum that we're obliged to do. But I think, and again, I think this particular situation really demonstrates how we have to take responsibility beyond what we ought, but, go beyond the letter of the law to do more, to, enable other people to afford, whether it's medical care or food, or just to protect people from spread of things because we're so tangled up. So yeah, I think the beyond seems to be a luxury, but I think it is a necessary luxury in our world, judging favorably. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting and important. I'm interested also in the element of the Rav Yishmael. I mean, he seems to transgress in some way and go into the innermost sanctum. There's in this imagination, he is the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, and I wonder and what you can say about that, and also in terms of kind of this idea that anyone can bless. Is this a critique on kind of hierarchy that exists in the system that we have now? That Rabbi Yishmael, who is, I mean, essentially seen in this story as a reflection of the ordinary person who can bless God. What's it saying about hierarchy and how that influences this kind of this beyond the letter of the law view, or this merciful view?
That's a great question. I mean, I think in terms of hierarchy, it's actually really subversive, because tractate brachot is about people's obligation to bless, and so it's about giving blessing to God, and in theory, for every single aspect of our daily life, from the food that we eat to waking up and saying more formal prayers, and this particular story is brought as proof that God prays every day. And what does God say God's prayer. God prayer say, oh, I hope to kind of really, do this and use rachamim instead of din and go beyond midat hadin, and to kind of be able to sort of overcome my anger. And then there's like a little sidebar. Oh, God's angry? How could you say that? That's another daring thing to say. It's like, oh yes, there's another verse somewhere that says God sort of, can storm and rage. So it's incredibly subversive. And, while the whole sort of enterprise of having to pray may feel like, oh, who is this God who needs our petty prayers? No, God prays also. And we have that power to kind of bless God. So it kind of gives us some power. It is definitely subversive. There's a lot there to kind of think about.
Yeah, 100%. I love it. I love a subversive text, and I think what we've seen, for those of us who have joined us more regularly, we've seen that the rabbis of the Talmud and the people in the Bible and all the texts that we've seen over the past 15 weeks show these really complex emotional chemistries that exist in the rabbinical imagination. This is clearly someone who is powerless in a space and needs to work out a way to imagine a world that's better. My last question to you is one kind of intended for the audience, and just to hear a bit about how you take this approach into your life and how we can take it into our lives. What does it look like to embody this text in our own lives? How can we take that message of blessing, but in this particular way, into our own lives?
Thank you, Joe. That's a really good question. And I think there are moments in which we want to react with anger towards other people, towards God. And I know personally, my moments of wanting to, it's that kind of loss of, determination and control, not being able to go ahead as we want to. And those are moments that are painful, and I wouldn't say that I always succeed, but I think when I can reflect and kind of like allow that sort of compassion to come back in, either towards myself or towards other people, that is, I think, a good way to go forward. One that hopefully I'll, having this discussion today will remind me to kind of go back to this text. But I think one in particular in this period in which we sort of kind of put the focus on mourning and that sense of loss, thinking about this nostalgic feeling that we have for something, and then also remembering that we miss it, but it wasn't as perfect, and kind of, can we reimagine something better? Because I think in the end, that is our power, our imagination for a better world, for being compassionate, for taking responsibility for other people, and bringing blessings to those around us.
Yeah, that's really, really beautiful. I think it's so important to hear that right now. And I think it's wonderful to see a text that reflects a moment of clear mourning, even 200 years or 100 years after the temple has been destroyed. Rabbi Yishmael has one choice. He has this choice to be bolder and be more creative and more subversive, to move forward. And I think that's a message that I think we can all take with us this weekend and going forward in this period that's incredibly difficult for a lot of people. And thank you so much for your voice on this, because it's been really, really valuable to me and to our audience as well. So everyone watching, thank you so much for coming along today for It Says What. And if you'd like to see more of JW3's programming, check out our website and JW3 Online. This coming week, we have Musicals Uncovered with Neil Marcus, if you're a musical lover. But most of all, thank you to Rabbi Dina Brawer for coming to speak to us today about this unexpected and subversive text that provides comfort at this difficult time for a lot of people. So thank you so much, Dina, and Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Thank you so much, Joe. Shabbat Shalom to everyone in London and everywhere else. It was fun to be here.